My son-in-law slid a stack of papers across the marble kitchen island and sneered, "Sign the workshop over by tomorrow morning, old man." When I refused, he hurled a glass of ice water directly into my face while his wealthy business associates looked on and laughed. My daughter sat there quietly sipping her wine and murmured, "Dad, it's just a building." I left the room without a single word. The following morning, I placed an envelope in his hands and watched him tear it open. Welcome to Honor Revenge Stories, a place where real pain, real patience, and real justice come together in stories worth sitting with. If this is your first time here, I hope you'll stay close and follow along for more. Before we go any further, let me ask you something simple. Are you listening on headphones today, or through a speaker? It changes the way a story like this one lands, I think. One more thing, some details in this story have been shaped for the telling, and any resemblance to specific real people or events is entirely coincidental. What matters most is the truth at the center of it. That kitchen alone was bigger than the entire ground floor of the house where Lynette grew up. Imported Italian marble ran across every surface. The refrigerator cost more than my first cargo van. Creighton had designed the space to make anyone who entered feel diminished, and most evenings it worked on me. Most evenings, not this one. Vernon Creighton. Drexel set his crystal whiskey glass down on the marble island with a sharp crack that rang off the vaulted ceiling. 38 years old, broad-shouldered, wearing a charcoal blazer that probably cost $3,500. He had the kind of jawline that photographed well, and eyes that never quite met yours straight on. "We need to talk right now." I had been standing near the window, watching the last of the October light fade out over the backyard. The old workshop sat at the far edge of the property, its weathered pine walls catching the last of the dusk in a faint glow. I turned to face him. "Then talk," I said. Creighton pushed a stack of legal documents across the marble toward me. The pages were crisp, freshly printed, clamped together with a large black binder clip. He tapped the top sheet twice with his index finger, the gesture of a man who wants the room to know he considers himself the sharpest one in it. "This is a deed transfer agreement," he said. "Simple, clean. You signed the workshop over to me as collateral for a bridge loan. I need closed by Monday morning. My new residential development out in Goochland is fully approved. The financing is 90% there, and I just need one more solid piece of collateral to close the gap. The workshop sitting on this property is the cleanest asset on the table." I looked down at the documents. Every clause in the fine print confirmed exactly what he had laid out. A complete and unconditional transfer of ownership. Permanent. "That workshop is not yours to leverage Creighton," I said, keeping my voice level. "Rosalind and I built that structure with our own hands in 1986. It was the first building we ever owned outright. It carries no corporate title, and it is not tied to any account you can touch." Creighton produced a short laugh from somewhere in the back of his throat, the kind designed to make the other person feel foolish. "Ha. With all due respect, Vernon, that shed is sitting on my land," he said, opening his arms wide. "It is on my deed under my property taxes inside my fence line. You have been living in it rent-free for 2 years because Lynette and I were generous enough to allow it. You pull food from my kitchen, you run appliances off my electric bill, and you have not put a single dollar into this household since you moved in after the funeral." My chest tightened the way it does when something true and something cruel arrive bound up in the same package. "I am asking you not to do this," I said quietly. "That building carried meaning for your wife's mother. It carries meaning for me. Find another way to secure your loan." Creighton came around the island, closing the distance between us until he was close enough that I could pick up the whiskey on his breath. "There is no other way," he said, his voice dropping lower and harder. "And frankly, I am done walking on eggshells around your feelings about a rotting wooden shack. You are a 68-year-old widower with no income, no investments, and no plan. You ought to be grateful we haven't already placed you in assisted living." I turned toward Lynette. She was stationed on the far side of the island, one hip resting against the counter, a glass of red wine cradled in her hand. She had on an ivory silk blouse and her mother's pearl earrings, the ones I'd given Rosalind on their 25th anniversary. I studied my daughter's face, waiting for something, anything, a frown, a syllable, the faintest sign that she still knew me as her father. Lynette took a slow sip and looked just past my left shoulder. "Creighton makes a valid point, Dad." Her voice was flat, and even the way a statement sounds when it has been rehearsed until all the feeling has been ironed out. "You've been here 2 years. We have never asked a thing of you. The least you can offer is some help when Creighton needs it. It's just a building. Those 4 words landed somewhere behind my sternum and sat there. It's just a building. I looked back at Creighton and pushed the documents firmly across the marble toward him. My answer is no, I said. It will not change tonight, and it will not change by morning. That workshop is not for sale, not for collateral, and not open to negotiation. Creighton's jaw went tight. The polished surface cracked at its edges, and what showed beneath was something uglier, something that had likely always been there, waiting for a moment exactly like this. "You have until tomorrow morning to reconsider," he said, his voice drawn taut as a wire near its limit. "Because if those papers are not signed, my attorney will begin the process of reclassifying that structure as an unauthorized occupancy on my registered property. And then you will not simply lose the workshop, you will lose any right to set foot on this land at all." From the dining room just off the kitchen came a low murmur. 3 men in expensive suits were gathered around the long oak table, Creighton's prospective business partners, who had arrived an hour earlier with firm handshakes and hungry eyes. They had plainly heard every word. One shifted in his chair and leaned toward the man beside him, whispering something I couldn't catch. I stood perfectly still and looked at my son-in-law. He was breathing harder than the exchange called for. His hand rested on the marble island near his whiskey glass, fingers curled slightly inward. I watched that hand. He reached for the glass, and something cold moved through me before I'd even registered what was coming. The water hit before I could step back. Creighton swept the crystal glass off the marble in one hard motion, and the ice water caught me full across the face, the cold of it sharp enough to stop my breath. Ice cubes struck my forehead, glanced off the bridge of my glasses, and clattered across the marble floor. The water streamed down my nose, soaked into the collar of my cardigan, and dripped steadily from my chin onto the polished stone beneath me. From the dining room, one of the business partners let out a short, hard sound, nearly a laugh, before pulling it back. Creighton loomed over me, chest heaving, the empty crystal glass still gripped in his hand. His face had gone deep red, and there was something in his expression that looked almost satisfied, as though he had been waiting a long time for this, and it had felt exactly as good as he'd imagined. "You are a freeloader, Vernon," he said, leveling the glass at my chest. "You are a pathetic, useless old man who has been eating my food and breathing my air for 2 years without contributing one single thing to this family. You will sign those papers by tomorrow morning, or I will have security haul every piece of junk out of that workshop and change the locks tonight. Do you understand me?" The water was still tracing a line down the side of my neck. My glasses were fogged. My cardigan hung cold and heavy across my shoulders. I did not lift my hand to wipe my face. I did not raise my voice. What I did was turn my head slowly to the right, toward my daughter. Lynette was still holding her wine glass. She had not moved through any of it. She was looking at me now, at my dripping face, at the ice scattered across the floor, at the humiliation her husband had staged in front of 3 strangers. Her pearl earrings caught the kitchen light. She blinked once. Then she turned away, walked smoothly around the island, and went into the dining room to join the guests. She said something to one of the men in a warm, easy tone, as though she had simply stepped out to freshen her drink. My heart did not shatter in that moment. It had been fracturing slowly for 2 years already. What happened then was more like the last thread finally giving out. Quiet and final, the way an old rope surrenders, not with a snap, but with a sigh. I turned and walked out of the kitchen. The October air met my wet face like a second blow, colder and more honest than the first. I crossed the back lawn in the dark, my shoes sinking into the soft grass, the mansion's lights casting long shadows behind me. The workshop waited ahead, its pine walls pale beneath the moon. The deadbolt slid home behind me. I pulled my glasses off and cleaned the lenses on the tail of my undershirt. My hands did not shake, which caught me off guard. I had been braced for them to. Then the past arrived the way it always does in that building after dark, without announcement, without permission. Rosalind on the low wooden stool in the corner, a kerosene lamp sitting on an overturned milk crate, its light thrown across the pages open in her lap. 1986. 2 years married, nothing to our name. She raised her eyes above the rims of her reading glasses, and her face opened into a smile. "You know what I love most about this place, Vernon? Tell me," I said, still drawing the hand plane along a piece of red oak. "It smells like something real," she said. "Something built with your actual hands. Not on loan, not leased from somebody else. Ours." I stood with my shoulders against the workshop wall and let the full truth of what had taken place in that kitchen settle into my bones. Then I went to the bed, got down on one knee, and folded back the worn braided rug along the baseboard. The seam of a loose board underneath was all but invisible in the dim light. Beneath that board was something I hadn't laid a finger on in 5 years, something I had quietly hoped I'd never have reason to reach for again. The combination lived in my hands, not my head. 4, right 2, left 1 right. A clean, solid click rang out in the stillness, heavier than it had any right to sound. The black steel box held 3 things. First, a satellite communicator, matte black commercial-grade encryption, built to bypass commercial cell networks, entirely untraceable through standard methods. I'd sourced it in 2018 from a private security consultant in Washington, back when Whitmore Woodcraft and Design was still running at capacity. It hadn't been switched on since the week Rosalind was buried. Second, a small silver memory card bound in a wrap of black electrical tape, carrying encrypted records of every financial document, trust filing, and corporate instrument tied to the blind trust I'd set up after selling Whitmore Woodcraft and Design to a private equity firm in late 2020 for $1.2 billion. Everyone on the outside, Lynette among them, had been left to believe the company had quietly collapsed beneath a mountain of medical bills and weak leadership during Rosalind's illness. The truth was that every element of the transaction had run through the blind trust, sealed under a non-disclosure agreement that wiped it from any public record. The buyers had rebranded the whole operation almost immediately under a different name, which buried the trail for anyone who didn't already know exactly where to dig. The version of events that the world accepted had been built with care, reinforced by lawyers, and held in place ever since. Third, a letter. The envelope had gone the pale color of old bone. The paper inside had grown soft along its creases, refolded so many times the fibers had given up resisting. Rosalind's script across the front was tight, and even each letter leaning slightly inward, the hand she used when she was writing something meant to outlast the moment. For the day you need to remember who you are. She had pressed it into my palm on the morning of her last lucid day 4 years ago in a room on the 4th floor of VCU Medical Center. She had been 59 years old. Her grip on my hand was fierce enough to whiten her knuckles, and she held my gaze with the exact quality of attention that had always meant she was entrusting me with something heavy. Vernon, her voice was frail, but it didn't waver. The money cannot save Lynette from herself. That is not something you can do for her. What you can do is keep what we built from being weaponized against you. I told her she was carrying worry that didn't belong to her. I told her Lynette was our daughter and that things would work out. Now, I lowered myself onto the edge of the workshop bed with the envelope lying flat across my hands, and I sat with the particular ache of having been wrong about someone you love. It begins in the center of the chest and expands not a sharp pain, but a heavy, diffuse one, the kind that seeps through you, the way cold seeps through walls. I rested the letter on the workbench next to the lamp. I wasn't prepared to open it. Some things require a slower approach. I reached for the satellite communicator instead. 90 seconds to power up several encrypted verification screens cycling past before a clean interface appeared. The signal meter rose to 4 bars. Secure connection established. I dialed from memory. 2 rings. Vernon? Aldous Pemberton's voice was quiet and unhurried, belonging to a man who had long since stopped minding calls that came at difficult hours. 65 years old, a corporate attorney who had stood alongside me for 3 decades. Outside counsel for Whitmore Woodcraft, first then the man who had engineered the blind trust that had kept my financial life completely dark for the past 3 years. Apart from 2 federal accountants, he was the only living person who held the complete picture of what I owned. "It's me, Aldous," I said. "I've been expecting this call," he said. No surprise in it, only the measured steadiness of a man who had been watching something build from a distance and had seen it arrive precisely where he'd expected. "How long have you been watching him?" 14 months, Aldous said. "From the time you asked me to. I didn't want to come to you until I could be sure. Vernon, I'm sure." My jaw set hard. I pressed the communicator against my ear until I felt the edge of it. "How bad?" Aldous drew a slow breath through his nose, the same tell he'd always had before delivering news he'd rather not carry. "Bad enough that tonight can't wait," he said. "Not tomorrow morning. Tonight." There's a timing matter I need to lay out for you face to face. Meet me at the Belmont Diner on Broad Street. 40 minutes. I got up from the bed. The mansion windows were still burning gold and warm against the black October sky outside the workshop's narrow pane. Somewhere behind that light, Lynette was refreshing her wine and keeping the evening pleasant for her husband's money men, while the man she had shaped into what he'd become had no notion that the floor under his Italian marble had just begun to give. "I'll be there in 30, I said. I did up my cardigan over the collar that was still damp, tucked the envelope carefully into my inside breast pocket, and held it there against my chest, where Rosalind had always said the things that mattered most should ride. I locked up the workshop and walked out into the night. The air carried dried leaves and the dull pressure of rain coming. Richmond murmured in the distance, unhurried and indifferent, the way a city always sounds when one man's whole world is quietly being remade in the dark. The Belmont Diner on Broad Street was the kind of establishment that never quite shut down and never quite fully opened either. At 2:00 in the morning, the fluorescent tubes overhead gave off maybe half their light. The coffee tasted of burnt grounds and straightforwardness. The only other people in the room were a long-haul truck driver nursing a bowl of soup at the counter, and a night shift nurse with her eyes on her phone in the far booth. No one looked my way when I entered. I took the corner booth at the back, unobstructed view of the front door and the kitchen window both. A reflex from years of closing deals in rooms where situational awareness was part of the work. I flagged the tired waitress with the gentle eyes, ordered black coffee, circled both hands around the mug, and sat still. Aldous Pemberton came through the front door at 2:12. He was built wide, carrying his weight. Well, even at 65, his silver hair cropped close. His stride the unhurried kind that only comes after decades of having nothing left to demonstrate. Dark wool overcoat, leather briefcase swinging from one hand, the same case I had first seen 30 years ago. The same one that had been open on the table the day we executed the founding papers for Whitmore Woodcraft and Design in a conference room on Grove Avenue in 1990. He took the seat across from me, set the briefcase down beside him, and his eyes went straight to my collar. "Still wet," he said. "About 2 hours ago," I said. Aldous' jaw drew tighter for a moment. He ordered coffee without a glance at the menu, held off until the waitress had gone, then brought his forearms down onto the table and leaned in. "Before we open the briefcase," he said, "I need to say something. I have known you for 30 years, Vernon. I was there when you were building that company out of a rented warehouse with used tools. I watched you sit with Rosalind through every one of her last 6 months. And I watched you settle into that workshop and live in the same 3 sweaters for 2 years, because being near your daughter mattered more than your comfort." He paused, pressing his lips together. "What Creighton Drexel did tonight is assault. We could file a criminal complaint first thing tomorrow and have him arraigned before the weekend ends." I shook my head slowly. "A misdemeanor gives him something small to manage," I said. "I don't want to inconvenience him. I want to take him apart." Aldous held my gaze for a beat, then gave one deliberate nod, the nod he always produces when he has satisfied himself that a client knows precisely what they're after. "Then, let me show you what we have," he said. He unlatched the briefcase and drew out a thick manila folder, placing it flat on the table between us. The tab carried a date range January through October, 2023, and a single name. "Creighton Drexel is not merely in financial trouble," Aldous said, opening to the first tabbed section. "His residential development portfolio has been drowning since February. 3 projects in Goochland and 1 in Mechanicsville, all hemorrhaging cash, all carrying debt loads he cannot keep up with. He is more than $4 million in arrears to private lenders who are not known for extending goodwill." Aldous tapped the top sheet. "He has been shuffling money through shell accounts to manufacture the look of liquidity, a classic float scheme. The float gave out 6 weeks ago. That's why he wanted the workshop," I said. The words arrived flatter than I'd meant them to. "He needed fresh collateral because everything else is already spoken for." "That's correct," Aldous said. "But this is where it turns considerably worse." He moved to the second tab section and pushed the folder toward me. "My forensic accountant first flagged these 8 months ago. He then spent the following 6 months building the documentation solid enough to bring to you." I looked down at the page. A loan agreement from a private lending firm out of Norfolk. The figure under the first line, $450,000, dated February of this year. At the bottom on the line for primary guarantor was my name, Vernon R. Whitmore. The signature below it was not mine. I stared at it. A cold moved through my chest that had nothing to do with the damp collar of my cardigan. He practiced it, Aldous said quietly. Our handwriting analyst confirmed he most likely worked from samples, greeting cards, grocery lists, anything bearing your signature that moved through that house. He put real effort into this, Vernon. This was not done on impulse. I turned to the next page. Another loan, 600 Thrusters. March, my name again? The same patient imitation of my hand at the bottom. How many? I asked. 4 agreements, Aldous said. Over 8 months, combined total of $2.1 million, all of it secured against the workshop property using a fabricated appraisal that presented it as an unencumbered asset. He paused. A promissory note, for context, is a written commitment to repay a specified debt. By forging your signature as guarantor, Creighton made you legally liable for $2.1 million in loans you never agreed to and had no knowledge of. My coffee had cooled. I pushed the mug aside. Vernon, Aldous said, there is one more thing in this folder. I need you to take a breath before you look at it. He reached across and turned to the final tabbed section, and the name on the cosigner line of the third agreement emptied the air from my lungs entirely. The name was Lynette Drexel, not a forgery. I had watched my daughter form that exact signature since she was old enough to grip a pen, the slightly elongated D the way the final E curled back on itself. It was hers, written with the easy steadiness of someone who had not paused before setting pen to paper. I turned to the next agreement, her signature again, and the one after that. 3 out of 4 contracts, $2.1 million borrowed against my name and my property, and my daughter had sat beside her husband at some table, in some room I would never see, and signed her name to papers that made me responsible for his fraud. My throat tightened until swallowing took effort. She knew, I said. The words came out scraped and rough-worn raw somewhere behind my sternum. She knew, Aldous confirmed. His voice went careful the way it does when he is delivering something he'd rather not be delivering. She didn't merely co-sign. According to the account records, the loan proceeds were deposited directly into a joint account held by both Creighton and Lynette. She had full access to that account and made withdrawals within days of each deposit. I pressed my palm flat against the tabletop. The laminate was cold and faintly tacky, the texture of a surface cleaned 10,000 times and never quite restored. I fixed my attention on that sensation because it was immediate and concrete and asked nothing of me emotionally. It didn't hold for long. She had worn Rosalind's pearl earrings tonight. She had stood in that kitchen and told me I owed them for the roof, above my head, fully aware that she had already helped run $2 million through accounts built on my forged name. The earrings, the wine, the smooth, rehearsed cadence of her voice. Tell me about the workshop appraisal, I said, because I needed to see the whole architecture of what they had constructed together. Aldous moved to a new section. Creighton had commissioned a private appraisal of the workshop structure and the land beneath it. The appraiser he used, Aldous noted, had a well-documented history of generating inflated valuations for clients with particular requirements. The report classified the workshop as a standalone residential dwelling on an independently zoned parcel, valued at $900,000 free and clear of any encumbrance. Aldous looked at me across the top of the folder. None of that holds up. The structure is legally classified as an accessory building on the main residential parcel. It cannot be separately encumbered without your explicit consent and a formal partition filing. The entire collateral basis for these loans is fraudulent, which makes the lenders victims as well. Correct, I said. Private lending operations outside standard bank oversight, Aldous said. They failed to perform adequate due diligence, but they were still defrauded. That matters for how law enforcement will approach this. I closed the folder and rested both hands on top of it. The fluorescent tube above our booth flickered once held, then resumed its steady buzz. The truck driver at the counter was settling up. Outside, a delivery vehicle rolled slowly past the window, its headlights sweeping briefly through the wet dark on the asphalt. I thought about the summer Lynette turned 16. She had come home one afternoon with a bruise along her forearm, where a classmate had shoved her into a locker. She hadn't cried in front of anyone at school. She had waited until she reached the workshop, climbed onto the workbench stool the way she always had since she was small, and then let herself come apart. I had sat beside her for 2 hours, not hurrying her, not trying to fix anything, just present. When she finally went quiet, she said, "You're the only person who never makes me feel stupid for being sad." I had taken that to mean something that would hold. "Vernon," Aldous' voice drew me back. "There is one more folder. I went back and forth about bringing it tonight." He reached into the briefcase a second time. "I decided you needed the full picture before Monday." My gaze fell to the thin envelope he set on the table. It was unlike the financial documents, lighter, more deliberate in the way it had been prepared. "What happens Monday?" I asked, though something low in my stomach had already formed an answer. "That's what's in here," Aldous said. He rested 2 fingers on top of the envelope without breaking the seal. "Creighton reached out to a probate attorney 6 weeks ago. They have been corresponding by email through his company server." He paused. "Vernon, a probate attorney in Virginia, handles estate law, and in certain circumstances, legal guardianship proceedings, the kind in which a family member petitions a court to declare an elderly relative legally incompetent." The coffee cup in front of me seemed to recede. Aldous slid the envelope across, and I looked at my own name printed on the opening line of the document inside, not listed as a person, but as a subject. The title read, "Petition for Emergency Conservatorship of Vernon R. Whitmore." I read it the way you read something you already know, will hurt slowly 1 line at a time, giving each word its full weight before moving forward. "A conservatorship," Aldous said. "Before I could ask, is a legal mechanism by which a court removes an adult's right to govern their own affairs, financial and personal alike, and places that authority in someone else's hands. In Virginia, an emergency conservatorship can be granted without the subject present at the initial hearing, based solely on the petitioner's sworn testimony and a supporting affidavit. Once a judge signs the temporary order, the subject loses the legal standing to access their own accounts, direct their own medical care, execute contracts, or in some cases choose where they reside. That temporary order could sit untouched for months while the court worked toward scheduling a full hearing. Creighton had prepared the petition for filing Monday morning, first thing. The grounds he cited were that I was experiencing rapid cognitive deterioration, that I had turned verbally and physically threatening toward members of my household, and that I had lost the capacity to manage my personal affairs or guarantee my own welfare. I flipped to the affidavit section. It bore Lynette's name and was written as if in her voice. "My father has shown increasing signs of confusion and disorientation over the past several months. He frequently misplaces items and becomes agitated when asked simple questions. On the evening of October 11th, he became verbally threatening toward my husband during a routine household discussion and had to be physically restrained to prevent harm to others. I am deeply concerned for his safety and for the safety of those around him. Placement in a secure memory care facility is, in my judgment, as his closest next of kin, the only compassionate course of action remaining." October 11th was this evening. That routine household discussion was Creighton commanding me to surrender the workshop and then throwing ice water across my face. She had composed the affidavit in advance. She had put it to paper before the night's events even occurred, then penciled in the date afterward. My hands stayed still. That caught me off guard the same way it had 2 hours earlier in the workshop. But a pressure built behind my eyes, slow and accumulating, finding no exit. I had to lower the document and hold my thumb and forefinger against the bridge of my nose and just breathe. "She was observing me," I said, "for weeks, collecting incidents." "Almost certainly," Aldous said. "The petition cites no fewer than 4 separate occasions over the past 2 months. Reading glasses set down in the wrong place. A habit of eating alone in the workshop instead of joining them at the table. One instance where you apparently didn't answer when Lynette called to you from across the yard." His voice went tight. Every unremarkable moment of a 68-year-old man in grief living quietly in a shed was recast as clinical evidence of a failing mind. My gaze dropped to my hands resting on the table. Those hands had pushed a belt sander across 10,000 board feet of hardwood. They had executed contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. They had held Rosalind's hand each night through the last 2 years of her life, through the nights when she no longer held my name in her memory, but still found me in the dark. A memory surfaced without announcement, the way the sharpest ones tend to arrive. Rosalind, 11 days before the end, rotating her head on the pillow toward me in the hospital room. Her voice reduced almost to nothing, but her eyes focused and certain. "Vernon, I need you to make me a promise." "Anything," I said. "Promise me you won't let them turn your love for Lynette into something they use against you. Love is not surrender. You were the one who showed me that. Don't let yourself forget it." I had brought her hand to my lips and given her my word. I worked through the petition to the very last page. Then I placed it on the table, aligned its edge against the corner, and met Aldis's eyes. "They want to put me in a memory care facility," I said, "so Creighton can reach the blind trust." "That would be the end game, yes," Aldis said. "With a court declaring you incompetent and Lynette installed as conservator, she gains standing to go before a judge and demand access to your financial holdings. The trust has strong insulation, but a conservatorship-backed legal campaign sustained long enough could pry the structure open. And this gets filed Monday," I said before he could continue. "Before you had any opportunity to respond," Aldis confirmed. I settled back against the booth. The diner moved at its own slow nocturnal pace around us. The waitress was dragging a cloth across the counter. The nurse in the far booth had drifted off with her phone in her hand. Through the glass, the sky along the horizon had begun to thin from black toward the first gray wash of early morning. I slipped 2 fingers into my breast pocket and drew out Rosalind's letter. I opened it with care, working my thumb along the softened folds. Her hand was compact and unhurried on the faded paper. I read it for the first time since the morning she placed it in my keeping. "Vernon, if these words have reached you, then what I feared has come true. I am not angry about it, and I don't want that for you either. Anger hollows out the one who carries it. I want something different for you. I want you to feel clear. Clear on who you are and what you stand for. Clear on what the two of us made together, and clear on the fact that nobody, not Creighton, not Lynette, not a single soul, has the right to strip that from you. You did not raise Whitmore Woodcraft and design from nothing by going faint-hearted at the hard moments. Don't go faint-hearted now. I love you. I am proud of you. Jung Ko Jiao." That closing line was Vietnamese, a language Rosalind had absorbed from a neighbor in our first apartment 30 years ago, and which had lived between just the two of us ever since brought out when she needed words to land with full force. It meant, "Do not bow your head." I refolded the letter and pressed it back into my pocket. "Aldis," I said, "Monday morning is the deadline. Walk me through exactly what we are going to do." Aldis pulled his chair closer, drew a fresh legal pad toward him, and clicked his pen open. "I was beginning to wonder when you'd ask," he said. He turned to a clean sheet and set the pen down with the unhurried precision of someone who had spent 30 years converting other people's catastrophes into executable plans. "Tell me what outcome you want," he said. "Not what you think the law will permit, what you actually want." I cupped both hands around my lukewarm mug and let the question sit for a moment. Around us, the diner kept its half-lit hum, the waitress topping off the truck driver's cup at the counter without him raising a finger, the fluorescent tubes overhead running at half their capacity. Out on Broad Street, Richmond had settled into the muted register it holds in the hour before dawn, quieter than the day, but never quite still. A delivery vehicle rumbled somewhere above on the overpass. Headlights moved across the wet glass of the window. "I want the workshop still standing when this is over," I said, "not shielded by a court filing physically standing every board where I left it. I want Creighton to know with absolute certainty that his authority over that building existed only in his own head, never, in fact, not for one day of the 2 years I slept there." Aldis made a note without lifting his eyes from the pad. "Continue." "Tomorrow morning, I hand him an envelope," I said. "He opens it in front of those 3 investors on his feet in that linen suit. And by the time he turns the last page, I want every door he thought was open to be shut and locked." Aldis raised his head. Nothing in his face shifted, but behind his eyes something came into alignment, the look of a man presented with a problem that falls squarely inside his capabilities. "All of that is within reach," he said, "but the window is narrow. Here is the sequence." He rotated the legal pad so we could both read as he built it out. "Let's start with the foreclosure. Creighton borrowed $4.2 million against this property through a boutique lender called Meridian Bridge Capital. What he does not know is that Meridian Bridge Capital is a wholly owned subsidiary of a holding company sitting inside your blind trust. From the moment Creighton inked that mortgage, you were his creditor. The bank he thought he was dealing with was yours." I nodded. Lynette had never known. No one had beyond Aldis and the pair of accountants who administered the structure. 3 years ago, when Creighton had settled into that chair, across from a Meridian loan officer, pressed the man's hand and walked away. Pleased with the rate he had secured, he had been congratulating himself on terms that I had set. For 3 years, he had been convinced he had found a favorable deal in the open market. For 3 years, those mortgage checks had been coming to me. Additionally, Aldous went on his pen, tapping the pad in the deliberate cadence he used when building toward a conclusion. He is currently 2 payments in arrears. His own mortgage agreement specifies that a third missed payment activates an automatic default provision. No courtroom required. No judge weighing evidence, no hearing penciled onto a docket. We file the foreclosure notice, and under Virginia law, the moment that notice hits the Register of Deeds, the property enters legal default and becomes subject to seizure within 72 hours. "File it tonight," I said. "The Register of Deeds opens at 8 tomorrow morning," Aldous said. "By 9, it is public record. By 10, pull any title search on that property, and it comes back. Flagged defaulted asset, active foreclosure. Should Creighton attempt to pledge it as collateral for anything while this is still in motion, he layers fresh fraud directly onto everything already documented." My mind went back to that evening in his kitchen, Creighton sliding a sheaf of legal papers across the marble island at me a voice level, telling me the workshop occupied his land, and that I ought to count myself fortunate to have a roof at all. I thought about the 3 partners positioned in the dining room doorway, and the one who had laughed when the ice water landed on my face. "Second," I said, "second the asset freeze." Aldous drew a single clean line beneath his first notation, deliberate, unhurried, the way he had always done, when pivoting from one pillar of a strategy to the next. 30 years of constructing arguments that had to survive cross-examination had made it automatic. The fraud record we have assembled over the last 14 months clears the bar for an emergency injunction. Tonight, I file with the federal court under our emergency protocol. A duty magistrate is on call around the clock for exactly this kind of request, provided the evidentiary threshold is met, and ours clears it handily. The magistrate weighs what we bring him, and if the evidence holds, he issues an order. Every account tied to Creighton and Lynette Drexel goes under a freeze pending the fraud investigation, checking savings business operating credit lines, investment portfolios. The whole picture collapses to zero the instant the order takes effect. "When does it take effect?" I asked. "If he signs tonight and given what we have in front of him, he will. The freeze drops at 8 tomorrow morning." Aldous said it. Same instant the foreclosure notice hits the record. Saturday morning. Creighton settles in to play host, fills his investors' glasses with champagne, and at that precise moment, every financial channel available to him goes dark. He will have no idea. The first sign will be a declined card or a balance check that returns nothing. And knowing him, that moment arrives inside the first hour. I let out a long, slow breath. The pressure that had been sitting behind my sternum since that kitchen confrontation started to ease, not lift entirely, but change quality, the way a snarled rope responds when someone stops yanking and instead finds the loose end and works it patiently. "And the conservatorship petition," I said. Aldous brought his pen down twice against the pad. "Move tonight," he said, "and by Monday's open of business, Creighton holds no active bank account and nothing liquid. To file a conservatorship petition, you first have to hire a probate attorney. Hiring an attorney means settling a retainer. Settling a retainer means getting to your money." He paused. "No money, no petition. It collapses at the threshold. He cannot turn the courts into a weapon once he can no longer pay the entry fee." I let that sit for a moment. Of everything Aldous had spread across that table 40 minutes ago, the conservatorship petition was the thing that had seized my breathing. The fraud, for all its ugliness and cold calculation, was still a recognizable kind of crime greed dressed up in paperwork. But what Creighton and Lynette had put into that petition was a different order of thing entirely. They had looked at a 68-year-old man who kept to a workshop, read his books, worked his small garden, and carried his grief the way private people do, and they had labeled him a danger to himself and to those around him. Invented symptoms, took the ordinary quiet of a man living alone, and reframed it on paper as evidence of deterioration. Were prepared to raise their right hands before a judge and say so. This had never been only about the money. It was about making sure nothing of him remained. "The envelope," I said. My voice held more steadiness than I actually possessed. 3 things go inside: the foreclosure notice, the fraud filing summary, and a printed copy of the conservatorship petition reproduced exactly as Creighton wrote it, so that when he opens it, he understands with complete certainty that I have read every word he set down about me. Aldous let a thin, grim smile cross his face. It stopped well short of his eyes, and it was not designed to do otherwise. "A precise instrument," he said. "Creighton told me he wanted a document from me. He stood in that kitchen and informed me I had until morning to produce a signed deed, or he'd put me on the street. So, that is what he is going to receive, a document from me, arriving on the schedule he himself named. Aldous held my eyes across the diner table, the surface tacky under the folders, the fluorescent panel throwing flat light across the legal pad, and I watched him walk the whole sequence through in his head, the order of events where the leverage was applied, where the plan might develop a crack and what would seal it. That was the particular discipline of how Aldous thought. Drafting a plan was only the first step. He ran it against every failure point he could conceive of before he'd allow it to move. There is one vulnerability I need to account for, he said. When Creighton reads that envelope, he will not be calm. Cornered men act without pattern. He may scramble to shift money ahead of the freeze. He may go straight to the private lenders. Crossing a state line becomes a possibility. Can he actually move anything before 8? I asked. Nothing of consequence, Aldous said. We've already reached the private lenders through back channels. They know the collateral on those loans is under active scrutiny and they've suspended disbursement voluntarily while they wait for the review to conclude. His conventional banking relationships won't push large transfers through on a Saturday without running their standard verification, and the crypto accounts he's been running as a parallel ledger are already flagged inside the fraud filing. Aldous pressed one final notation onto the pad. He has no road out. I turned toward the window and looked at North Boulevard lying dark beyond the glass. Pre-dawn was still the better part of an hour off the sky over the office towers, unchanged from the flat black that had held since midnight. Aldous closed the legal pad, then worked through the folders, methodically returning each one to his briefcase with the focused care of someone organizing for a campaign, not a morning errand. He set the tabs in order, satisfied himself with the sequence, and pressed the brass latches home 2 crisp snaps. Then his attention came back across the table to me. Vernon. He said, the professional tone he'd sustained for the past hour receding something older and quieter, taking its place the register that belonged to 2 men who'd shared enough years to speak plainly to each other. About the workshop. I want to be certain I have the full picture. Is there anything in how the property is legally structured that we need to shield on its own? A filing and encumbrance, any handle that Creighton's attorneys might grab onto during the proceedings. My mind settled on Rosalind perched on that low stool in 1986. A kerosene lamp sitting on an upended milk crate beside her, the quiet sound of pages turning while my hands were busy. The smell of raw pine and linseed oil in a rented storage space that had become, without either of us intending it, the true starting point of everything we built together. I thought about what Creighton had announced he meant to put there once the workshop was gone. A pool imported stone around it, the sort of thing that reads well in a listing photograph. That workshop existed before any of the rest of it, did I said. Before the money, before the trust, before any of it. Rosalind and I raised it from wood we sourced on a payment plan out of a salvage yard on Midlothian Turnpike. We paid $9 a board foot for the pine framing because that was the cheapest structural grade they carried. The concrete for the footings we mixed ourselves one Saturday morning, a rented mixer, a borrowed level, and the 2 of us. I stopped. It never appeared in a corporate filing because there was no reason it should. What that place belongs to us has no legal category, it just is. Aldous laid his pen down on the closed pad and sat with that for a beat, not speaking. Then he said, we protect it on the same terms, not on account of what it's worth, because it's yours. He collected his briefcase, got to his feet, buttoned his coat, and put his hand out across the table. I took it. The grip was the same one I'd first felt 30 years back in a conference room on Broad Street, firm, unhurried, the handshake of a man who held to what he gave his word on. Through the window, the first of the morning delivery trucks were rolling on North Boulevard, their headlights drawing long yellow lines through the thin October dark. The city was beginning its slow, indifferent turn toward another day. The courier reaches the workshop with the envelope by 9, Aldous said. Get some sleep if you can. I won't sleep, I said. He nodded once, the nod of someone who had already known the answer before the question formed. No, he said. I did not think so. I watched him push through the glass door and vanish into the darkened street, his wool overcoat catching the neon glow of the diner sign as he rounded the corner. I flagged down the waitress for another cup of coffee I had no business drinking. There I sat alone in the corner booth of the Belmont Diner on Broad Street at 3:00 in the morning, held inside that particular stillness a city takes on. In the dead hours, my hand pressed against Rosalind's letter through the fabric of my jacket, waiting on the sun to do what it had always done, indifferent to whatever any of us had constructed or destroyed while the world slept. I made the drive back to the Windsor Farms property in the dark, left my 14-year-old Accord on the service road behind the workshop, and slipped in through the side entrance without throwing the main lights. The place smelled the way it always did at that hour, pine resin and linseed oil, and underneath those the faint mineral cold of old concrete rising through the wood floor. 2 years I had woken up and gone to sleep inside that smell, and not once had I taken it for granted. Sleep was not something I attempted. I settled into the wooden chair beside the workbench and let the dark press close around me. My thoughts kept going back to Rosalind. Not the Rosalind of the hospital, not the Rosalind of those final months when the illness had drawn her steadily inward. The Rosalind of this building, of this particular life we had made here in the years before anything turned. It was the spring of 1986. 2 years married and so short on money that we kept a running tally of the checking account balance on a notepad stuck to the refrigerator, updated every time one of us spent $1. We had rented the workshop space for $195 a month from an older gentleman named Cletus, who owned a row of storage units on the west side of Richmond, and had taken a liking to us largely because Rosalind arrived each month with a slice of whatever she had baked that week. The first morning I turned a key in that workshop door and stepped into the empty room, I felt something I hadn't known since I was a boy. The specific electricity of a space that hadn't yet decided what it meant to become. Rosalind was beside me in her green canvas work apron, hair pulled back, a pencil riding behind her ear. She looked at the bare concrete floor and the single bulb swaying from the ceiling and said, "Vernon, this is it. This is where it starts." "Aw, it is a storage unit, Rosalind," I said. She laughed, and the sound of it claimed every inch of that empty room. "Everything worth building starts in a storage unit," she said, "or a garage, or a kitchen table. The building does not matter. The person standing in it does." For 3 years, we worked side by side in that space before we had enough to bring on our first employee. Rosalind kept the books on a second-hand ledger typewriter. I built the furniture. She sold it at weekend markets, at church fairs, out of the bed of our pickup in parking lots across Henrico County, negotiating prices with the quiet confidence of a woman who understood she had nothing to lose and a great deal still to gain. One rainy Tuesday evening in November, the roof opened up so thoroughly that we had to crowd every finished piece into the one dry corner of the room, and crouch on upturned buckets, watching the water find its way into every pot and bowl we owned. Rosalind looked at the ceiling, then at me, then at the row of carefully finished oak side tables, catching the light from overhead, and said, "You know what? I think this is the best night we have ever had." "The roof is leaking," I said. "I know," she said, "but look at what we built, Vernon. Look at what we actually built with our own hands. Nobody gave us that. Nobody can take it either." I pressed the heels of my hands against my eyes and held them there for a long moment in the dark of the workshop. She had been right about all of it. Right about the company, right about what money does to people who haven't built the character to hold it, and right about Lynette. The only thing she had been wrong about was believing she'd be alive to see it resolve. The sky through the workshop's small, high window had gone from solid black to the deep blue-gray that precedes proper dawn. Out on the main road somewhere, a car went by with its radio on a country song, drifting in and then away as it moved through the dark. I got to my feet, walked to the far wall, and pulled open the tall, narrow closet I had fitted into that corner during my first month there. On the top shelf, tucked behind a folded wool blanket, hung a long canvas garment bag with a brass zipper. I lowered it with care and spread it across the workbench. Then I drew the zipper back. The suit inside was charcoal gray, a bespoke cut from a tailor on Savile Row in London named Alistair, who had taken my measurements in the spring of 2018 during the final negotiation phase of the Whitmore Woodcraft sale. I had worn it exactly twice, once to the signing and once to Rosalind's funeral. I lifted it free and held it a moment. The cloth was dense and finely woven, the kind of material that does not wrinkle and does not make excuses for itself. I dressed slowly with intention, the way you dress when each step carries weight. White shirt, the dark silk tie Rosalind had chosen herself from a shop on Fifth Avenue the year before she fell ill. The charcoal jacket lay smooth across my shoulders, fitted the way Alistair had made it. I checked myself in the small oval mirror above the workbench. The man in the glass was not the one Creighton Drexel had thrown ice water at 12 hours before. That man was gone. The man in the mirror had raised a company out of salvaged wood and a second-hand ledger typewriter and sold it for a sum Creighton Drexel would never be positioned to fully comprehend. A soft knock at the workshop's side door broke the quiet of the morning. I crossed to it and pulled it open. A young man in a courier jacket stood on the step with a thick white envelope sealed in red wax. He placed it in my hands without a word turned and made his way back down the service road to his car. I stood there holding the envelope in both hands. It was heavier than its size suggested. By 10 in the morning, Creighton had assembled his audience with the studied precision of a man who understood that wealth is only half substance. The other half is theater, and theater requires the right stage. From the workshop window, I watched as the catering van came through the side gate, a cream vehicle with a discreet logo on the door panel, the kind of company that charged $350 per person, and made sure that figure never appeared anywhere a guest might stumble across it. 2 servers in black uniforms transferred silver trays to the long teak dining table on the back patio, arranging smoked salmon and imported cheeses and small ceramic bowls of something that caught the October light. A 3rd server built out the champagne station at the table's corner, with the focused economy of someone who had performed this exact setup at this category of house for this category of man many times before. The 3 investors arrived in separate cars, all within 15 minutes of one another. The oldest I placed immediately. Mid-60s, silver-haired, with the straight carriage and measured eyes of someone who had made serious money while he was still young and spent the years since cultivating the discipline not to surrender it. He stepped from a dark sedan, took in the estate, with the unhurried read of a professional assessing an asset rather than a man admiring a home, and shook Creighton's hand with the brief, sure grip of someone whose time had a price attached to it. The second investor was younger, mid-40s, athletic, the kind of man who runs half marathons and mentions it early in every conversation. He came in carrying a leather portfolio under one arm and spent the opening 5 minutes photographing the stone facade of the main house with his phone, which told me precisely what I needed to know about the way he made decisions. The third was quiet, heavyset, with the watchful stillness of a man who had long since concluded that listening returned better margins than talking. He accepted a glass of champagne, held it without drinking, and arranged himself slightly apart from the group in the way of someone who wants an unobstructed view of the whole table at once. Creighton was fully in his element. He had on a cream linen suit pressed to sharp creases and moved across the patio with the open, easy energy of a man whose confidence had been rehearsed so many times it had started to pass for something genuine. What comes next is the moment everything that had been moving quietly beneath the surface finally breaks through, and the man who believed he held all the cards learns exactly how wrong he was. Before we get there, I want to ask you, if someone you loved had been working against you in secret, would you confront them the moment you found out, or would you wait and let the truth do its own work? He laughed at precisely the right volume, swept a hand toward the estate with the ease of a man born to it, and filled champagne glasses with a generosity that communicated abundance without requiring the word. He walked the investors through the Goochland development project with the fluency of someone who had absorbed his own pitch until it felt like conversation, projected returns, market timing, conservative risk modeling, all delivered with the particular warmth of a man who wants you to feel invited rather than sold to. Lynette stood at his side in an ivory silk blouse and her mother's pearl earrings, catching the October light each time she moved. She smiled at the right beats touched Creighton's arm. At intervals, the two of them had clearly worked out in advance and managed the catering staff with the low-key authority of a woman who had been running this performance long enough that it required no conscious effort. She was very good at it. I had spent 2 years watching her become good at it, the way you observe someone honing a skill that has no connection to who they genuinely are. I stood inside the workshop at the workbench and looked at the sealed white envelope resting in my hands. The wax seal Aldous had pressed into the back of the envelope carried the mark of his firm, a small, unassuming imprint that meant nothing to a stranger and everything to anyone who understood what it stood for. To me, it represented 30 years of precision and trust and the quiet satisfaction of a man who had devoted his entire career to building instruments that performed exactly when they were called upon. My thoughts went to Rosalind. Not a long thought, not a memory with defined edges, just her presence, the particular quality of the attention she gave when she was watching me do something she believed in. She had looked at me that way the morning I signed the original incorporation papers for Whitmore Woodcraft and Design in 1990, seated across a conference table on Broad Street in a blazer she had borrowed from her sister, because we could not yet afford the kind of clothes that conference rooms expected. She had looked at me that way every time I had done something that mattered. I buttoned the top button of my jacket, straightened the dark silk tie, and lifted the envelope from the bench. The workshop door opened outward onto a short wooden step, and then the stone path that ran along the eastern edge of the lawn toward the back patio. I had walked that path several hundred times over 2 years, usually in worn khaki pants and a cardigan head, slightly down, moving with the unhurried ease of a man who had nowhere pressing to be. I had cultivated that walk deliberately. I wore it the way an actor inhabits a costume completely without self-consciousness because the role demanded it. That was not how I walked this morning. The October air was sharp and clean, carrying the smell of wet leaves and damp stone and the distant richness of the food laid out on the patio table. The grass still held the night's moisture oak leaves pressed flat and golden against the green. My leather shoes struck the stone path with a clean, deliberate rhythm that moved across the open lawn with the kind of quiet authority that has no need to announce itself. The oldest investor noticed me first. He had been listening to Creighton detail the projected rental yields on the Goochland development, wearing the politely attentive expression of a man who was withholding his judgment. Then his gaze drifted past Creighton's shoulder, crossed the lawn, and landed on me. What moved across his face was small but readable. The polite attention sharpened into something more, considered the specific alertness of a man whose instincts have registered something his conscious mind has not yet caught up with. He recognized the suit. He recognized what a suit like that said about the man inside it. He set his champagne glass down on the teak table with a soft, precise click. The second investor noticed the first setting his glass down and traced the line of his gaze. The third, the quiet one who had kept himself slightly apart from the group, had already been watching me for 10 seconds. Creighton felt the shift in his audience before he identified its source. He was mid-sentence something about annualized returns when he understood he had lost the room. He stopped. He turned. The smile on his face did not vanish at once. It wavered a fraction of a second, an involuntary dimming in a man whose confidence had just absorbed a blow he hadn't seen coming. And then he rebuilt it into something broader and more deliberate than it had been a moment before, which made it worse rather than better, because now it looked precisely like what it was. He said something low and quick to Lynette without taking his eyes off me. She turned, looked at me, and her expression did something complicated she couldn't entirely contain. Her jaw tightened. Her fingers adjusted around the stem of her champagne flute. She looked at the envelope in my right hand, then at my face, and I watched her try to read what was there and come up empty. Creighton moved across the patio toward me, hand already extended, pace, confident voice, pitched to reach his seated guests without appearing to try. "Vernon," he said with the overstated warmth of a man performing graciousness for an audience. "Glad you could join us this morning. I see you found yourself a nice jacket somewhere." He delivered that last line with a light dismissive amusement, the kind designed to remind everyone in earshot of the established distance between us. His eyes dropped to the envelope in my right hand, and something moved in them, a brightness, a hunger he was barely containing. "Is that what I think it is?" I stopped walking when we were 3 ft apart. I looked at him with no expression he could make use of. The morning light came full and direct across his face, and underneath the performance I could see the effort, the faint tightness at the corners of his eyes, the way his jaw was set a fraction harder than the casual smile above it called for. He was working. He had been working from the instant he watched me come across the lawn, and that work was costing him more than he wanted it to show. "You asked me for a document," I said. My voice came out level and low and reached the quiet patio without any effort at all. "I brought you exactly what you asked for." The oldest investor leaned forward slightly in his padded teak chair. The quiet one shifted his weight. The athletic one stopped scrolling through the photographs he had taken of the stone facade. Creighton reached for the envelope with the easy presumption of a man collecting something already owed to him. His fingers closed around it, and I felt the pull as he tried to draw it free. I did not let go immediately. I held the resistance for exactly 1 second, long enough for him to feel it, Long enough for the oldest investor, who was watching our hands with the focused attention of a man who had spent 40 years reading the small physical language of transactions, to register that something in this exchange was not what Creighton had led him to expect. Then I released the envelope and stepped back. Creighton pulled it toward his chest, and the triumphant tilt of his chin came back a little too fast, a little too emphatic, the overcorrection of a man who had felt uncertain for 1 second and needed to close off that feeling immediately. He turned back toward his guests with a broad smile and raised the sealed envelope briefly as though displaying a trophy. "Gentlemen," he said, "excuse me just one moment." He broke the red wax seal with his thumb. It cracked cleanly and the two halves fell to the stone patio. He reached into the envelope with his right hand and drew out the thick stack of documents with the satisfied ease of a man who has already decided what he is about to find. The October morning was very quiet. Beyond the garden wall somewhere, a car moved along the street and faded away. The champagne in the glasses on the teak table caught the sunlight and held it. Creighton looked at the first page. Creighton pulled the first document free from the envelope with the easy confidence of a man opening a birthday card he already knew contained a check. He tilted the page toward the October light eyes, narrowing as he worked through the dense legal language at the top. His lips moved, faintly tracing the words. Then they stopped. The color went out of his face all at once, the way it does when the body understands something a full second before the mind catches up. What he was holding was a formal mortgage default notice and foreclosure initiation issued by Meridian Bridge Capital LLC, the boutique lender that had put up the money for his $4.2 million place on Soulgrave Road in Windsor Farms. According to the notice, the borrower Creighton T. Drexel had missed his contractual payment obligations for 2 consecutive billing cycles, which automatically triggered the default provision in Section 14C of the original mortgage agreement. Under Virginia General Statute 4521, the creditor was now opening foreclosure proceedings. The property was subject to seizure and public auction within 72 hours. At the foot of the page, printed in clean black type, was the name of the sole owner of Meridian Bridge Capital, LLC, Vernon R. Whitmore. Creighton lifted his eyes from the paper and looked at me. His mouth had come open a little. The self-satisfied angle his chin had carried 30 seconds earlier was nowhere to be found. What had taken its place was something I had never once seen him wear before. Naked, unguarded bewilderment. The expression of a man whose entire picture of a situation has just been shredded in front of him. "What is this?" The words came out flat, not a question. More like the noise a person makes when the machinery of language temporarily ceases. "Keep reading," I said. He moved to the second document. His grip on it was not quite steady. There was a faint tremor in the paper as he raised it, barely audible, perceptible only to the people immediately beside him. Across the patio, the silver-haired investor who had put his champagne down when I first came across the lawn sat forward in his teak chair, recalibrating with the quiet focus of a man who makes serious decisions for a living. The second document was a formal summary of the fraud investigation filing submitted to the Virginia Secretary of State's office and the Financial Crimes Division at 6:47 that morning. In plain, precise terms, it set out that Creighton T. Drexel had forged Vernon R. Whitmore's signature on 4 separate promissory notes during an 8-month period, pulling a combined total of $2.1 million from private lenders by means of fabricated collateral documentation and a fraudulent property appraisal. A promissory note is a legally binding written commitment to repay a debt. By putting Vernon's name as primary guarantor without his knowledge, Creighton had made Vernon liable for obligations Vernon had never agreed to and never been told about. The filing identified Lynette Drexel as a co-conspirator. She had voluntarily co-signed 3 of the 4 agreements and received the fraudulent loan proceeds directly into a joint account. Creighton read the page. Then he went back to the top and read it again, the involuntary repetition of someone who needs the words to say something different and cannot accept that they won't. They didn't. One of the younger investors shoved his chair back from the teak table. The legs caught the stone patio and shrieked a sudden sharp sound. He leaned toward the man beside him, said something short and quiet, and both of them put their hands on their jackets. Creighton heard it. He looked toward his guests, and whatever he found on their faces took apart the last standing piece of the morning he had built. The silver-haired investor was already up. He lifted his linen napkin, folded it once with the deliberate composure of a man whose mind is made up, and laid it alongside his untouched plate. "Creighton," he said, his voice carrying the flat finality of a decision that is not open to discussion. "We are going to step out." Creighton's mouth opened. Nothing arrived. The three investors crossed off the patio without once looking back, their footsteps quiet on the stone steps, their departure, the kind of synchronized exit that belongs to men who have recognized a structure on fire and feel no duty to remain inside it. Lynette came at him fast across the patio, her heels clicking hard on the stone, and caught his arm. "Creighton, what is happening?" She pulled the words tight, fighting to keep the panic below the surface. "Who are those people? Why are they walking away? What is on that paper?" He didn't answer. His hands were already working the third document out of the envelope, fingers moving with the frantic, driven quality of someone who cannot stop themselves from reaching the bottom of something terrible. The third document was a printed email chain pulled from Creighton's company server, a correspondence between Creighton and a probate attorney in Mechanicsville. Attached to it was a fully drafted petition for emergency conservatorship of Vernon R. Whitmore, with Lynette's signed affidavit. Included in it, she had labeled her father a danger to himself and to others, and asked that he be transferred to a secured memory care facility. Creighton held the printout and stared. The timestamp at the head of the email chain showed it had gone out from his company account at 2:14 in the morning, less than an hour after I had walked away from his kitchen. Ice water still running down my face. He had composed it the same night. Then his knees gave. Not dramatically. No warning, no reaching for something to hold. His legs simply quit their job, and he hit the imported stone patio, hard the sheaf of legal papers fanning out around him as he fell, white pages lifting in the October air and settling against the legs of the empty teak chairs. Lynette cried out. His name broke out of her as she went down beside him and took his shoulders in both hands. Her voice split on the second syllable, an unguarded sound with nothing composed left in it. I stood at the edge of the patio and watched the pages come to rest across the stone. One sheet drifted to the base of the chair the silver-haired man had occupied. The fraud filing summary settled face up in the full morning sun, its text legible to anyone who looked. I smoothed the cuffs of my jacket and remained where I was. Creighton gathered himself gradually, the way a man does when his body has briefly switched off, to spare him from something too large to absorb. He got himself onto his hands and knees, drawing air in rough, uneven pulls, the cream linen suit marked with a dark smear where he had come down near a dropped serving dish. Lynette kept both palms pressed to his back, her voice low and insistent, cycling through the same question without getting anything back from him. "What does it say, Creighton? What is in those papers? Talk to me right now." He got upright with her, help latched onto her arm, and half-walked, half-steered her through the glass patio doors into the living room. He didn't look in my direction as he passed. I didn't go after him. I went back to the workshop, instead let myself in through the side door, and positioned myself at the window that looked through the floor-to-ceiling glass of the living room. I watched what unfolded. The way you watch a storm from a room you know will hold. Creighton went for his phone first. He called up his banking app with hands that weren't steady, and I watched his face cycle through 3 separate expressions over the course of about 8 seconds: concentration, then confusion, then the gray, bloodless look of a man confronting a number that has no right to be there. He hit the screen repeatedly, the same reflexive tap a person keeps repeating when they want a different result, and cannot bring themselves to stop asking for one. The balance was 0. The asset freeze Aldous had filed at 6:47 that morning had gone into effect at precisely 8:00, the instant the financial court system came online. Every account bearing Creighton Drexel's name, personal checking business, operating real estate holding company, high-limit credit lines, had been locked in the same moment, suspended pending the fraud investigation. Under federal financial crime statutes, a magistrate judge can issue an emergency asset freeze on the strength of documented evidence of ongoing fraud, sealing a suspect's finances before money can be moved or buried ahead of formal charges. Creighton had gone to bed the night before, believing he held $2 million and a bridge loan that was on its way. At this moment, he had nothing. Lynette moved toward him and pulled the phone from his grip. She studied the screen. Something happened in her face that I had not witnessed in 2 years. The smooth, polished control she had maintained throughout the same control she had worn in the kitchen the night before while her husband poured ice water over her father, gave way entirely. Her chin started to shake. Her eyes welled, and 2 tears tracked straight down before she got the back of her hand against her mouth. She unlocked her own phone, fingers trembling visibly, and opened her personal banking application. The account she had kept walled off from Creighton, the one earmarked for her own spending and her own savings, the one she had trusted to stay clear of her husband's unraveling, showed exactly the same figure. 0. She had put her name on 3 fraudulent loan agreements. She had taken direct deposits from stolen money into a joint account. Under the terms of the same emergency freeze order, her personal assets were swept in without carve-out. Lynette flung her phone across the room. It struck the far wall and skidded onto the antique Persian rug, its screen fractured from edge to edge. She wheeled on Creighton and seized the lapels of his ruined jacket with both fists. Knuckles' white voice coming apart and screamed straight into his face. "You told me it was a formality," she cried, raw and shaking. "You told me those papers were just a technicality, that Ba would never find out, that it would all be settled before the loans came due. You told me he was too out of it to notice. You lied to me, Creighton. You used me and lied to me, and now we have nothing." Creighton got hold of her wrists and tried to pry her hands loose from his jacket. "Stop," he said, his voice gutted of everything. "Just stop and give me a moment to think." "There is nothing left to think about." Lynette wrenched free and screamed it back at him. "They froze everything. Every last thing is gone." "What did you do?" "What exactly did you do?" I stepped back from the window. I did not feel what I had expected to feel. Somewhere in the long hours of planning, I had imagined satisfaction, and it had not come. What was there instead was the specific grief of watching someone you devoted your life to finally show you everything they were not. In one loud moment, but in the steady accumulation of small decisions that had arrived at last at this room on this morning. 2 people destroying each other over money that was never theirs to touch. A memory pushed up before I could hold it back. Lynette, at 8 years old, flying into the workshop after school, swinging herself onto the tall workbench stool, without asking the way she always did, as though that stool had been put there for no one else. She would watch me work with her chin resting on her folded hands, eyes tracing the movement of whatever tool I was using. "Dad," she said one afternoon, "does wood feel anything when you sand it? I think it feels like becoming something I said." She turned that over with the full gravity a child brings to a real question. "Then it is probably not scared," she said, "because it knows it is going to be better after." I pressed the heel of my hand hard against the edge of the workbench until the pressure brought me back to myself. Then from somewhere out on the main road, a siren still far off, but coming threading steadily through the quiet of Saturday morning toward Windsor Farms. 2 patrol cars rolled through the front gate at 11:14. Lights on, no sirens the approach officers use on a residential call when they want to read the situation before they commit to anything. I watched from the workshop porch as both vehicles angled across the circular driveway. 4 officers climbed out with the measured ease of people who had answered enough calls in neighborhoods like this one to know that the actual emergency almost never matched the report. Lynette came through the front door before they had reached the porch steps. In the few minutes since I had last seen her through the glass, she had reorganized herself. Eyes still red, but hair smoothed, blouse straightened, moving now, with a controlled urgency that bore no resemblance to the woman who had hurled her phone at the wall moments ago. She had stepped into a performance, and the speed with which she had made the transition told me she had been rehearsing some version of it for longer than this morning. She pointed at me the instant she came clear of the front door. "That man," she said, pitching her voice to carry exactly as much distress as she needed without tipping into hysteria. "My father, he came onto the patio during our business meeting and physically attacked my husband. Creighton is inside. He is injured. My father has been showing serious signs of cognitive decline for months, and this morning he had a complete break. He needs to go on an involuntary psychiatric hold before he injures someone else." The lead officer, tall, somewhere in his 40s, close-cropped hair, the evaluating stillness of a man who gathered information before he acted on it, looked past Lynette toward the workshop porch. I was standing there, in a charcoal Savile Row suit, with my hands in my pockets, which I suspected was not what he had been picturing at the far end of a psychiatric emergency call. He came toward me at a steady, unhurried pace. His partner moved to cut off Lynette with a raised palm and a quiet instruction to wait by the vehicle. "Sir," the lead officer said, stopping at the foot of the porch steps. "I am Officer Hargrove with the Richmond Police Department. We took a call reporting a physical assault at this address." "Are you Vernon Whitmore?" "I am," I said. "Please come inside. There is something I would like you to see before we go any further." Officer Hargrove held on me for a moment, then came up the steps. I pulled the workshop door open and directed his attention first to the small oval mirror on the wall, then upward to the roofline above the door frame. "I installed 3 security cameras on this building 7 months ago," I said. "They record continuously to an encrypted cloud server administered by my attorney Aldous Pemberton, whose contact information I can provide. The cameras take in the workshop entrance, the back patio, and the side lawn." I met Officer Hargrove's eyes directly. "They captured everything that took place on the patio this morning. They also captured what happened inside the kitchen of the main house last night." Officer Hargrove glanced up at the small black dome mounted beneath the workshop eave, then back at me. "Last night," he said, "my son-in-law threw a glass of ice water into my face during a disagreement over a legal document." I said, "I did not fall, I required no medical attention, and I did not retaliate. My daughter was in the room and did not step in. All of that is on the recording." I paused. "This morning I walked across the lawn and delivered a legal document to Creighton Drexel. He read it and lost consciousness briefly from the shock of what it contained. At no point did I come within arm's reach of him. From the driveway I could hear Lynette's voice climbing as she pressed her account on the second officer, her story expanding and sharpening with each repetition the way invented stories do when they sense they are not taking hold." Officer Hargrove uncapped his notepad. "You mentioned your attorney controls access to the footage. He can have a full copy on your department's secure server within the hour," I said. I crossed to the small desk in the corner and opened the top drawer. I took out a silver USB drive and a business card. This drive holds the fraud investigation documentation filed with the State Financial Crimes Division this morning. Over the past 8 months, Creighton Drexel forged my signature on loan agreements totaling $2.1 million. My daughter co-signed 3 of those agreements. An active asset freeze order is currently in effect on both of their accounts. I set both items on the desk. I am not asking you to arrest anyone on my word this morning. I am asking you to look at what is on that drive and form your own judgment." Officer Hargrove studied the drive, then the business card bearing Aldis's name and number. He picked them both up with the deliberate care of someone handling potential evidence. Outside, Lynette's voice cut across the driveway with rising insistence, telling the second officer he needed to listen, that her father was dangerous, that they were making a grave mistake. Her delivery had moved past distressed family member into something that would sound to any careful listener like a person working frantically to control a story that had already slipped away from her. Officer Hargrove stepped back to the doorway and looked out across the lawn toward the patio, where the scattered legal documents still lay on the stone white pages standing out sharply in the full morning sun. He keyed his radio, spoke 2 sentences, and listened to the reply. When he turned back to me, his expression had moved from careful neutrality into something nearer to professional resolve. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, "Dispatch has confirmed an active asset freeze order connected to this address filed this morning through the federal magistrate's office. That changes the nature of this call significantly." He stepped down from the workshop porch. "Stay here, please." I stayed on the porch. I watched Officer Hargrove cross the lawn toward the main house with the unhurried stride of a man who no longer needed to rush. His partner had gotten Lynette quieted near the second patrol car. She stood with her arms folded tight across herself, her blouse bright against the gray of the vehicle, still talking, voice low and quick, and growing more desperate with each sentence. The front door of the main house opened before Officer Hargrove reached the steps. Creighton came out onto the porch himself. He had changed his jacket. The stained cream linen jacket was nowhere in sight. A navy blazer had taken its place, as though swapping his clothes might somehow rewrite what the morning had already become. Phone in hand, he came down those front steps with his head high and one arm loose at his side, projecting the easy authority of a man who had concluded that playing cooperative was his shrewdest remaining option. He had gotten it completely wrong. He was certain Lynette had done her job. He was certain these officers had arrived to put me out. Vernon Creighton said, that voice oiled and faintly impatient, the register of money addressing labor. "Good of you to come so fast. My father-in-law's behavior has been growing more erratic, and he showed up here this morning and wrecked a meeting I was hosting. I'm prepared to give you a complete statement, and I'd request that you loop in my attorney before—" Officer Hargrove raised a single hand. Creighton went silent. Mr. Drexel. Officer Hargrove said, "Turn around and put your hands behind your back." Creighton blinked. "Excuse me." "Sir, turn around. Hands behind your back." The phone nearly went out of his grip. He caught it, swung his gaze from Officer Hargrove to the second officer, now positioned at the bottom of the steps, and then back. The composure he had worn coming out the door dissolved piece by piece, the chin first, then the set of his shoulders, then the careful flatness of his face, and underneath all of it, something open and frightened. "There's been a misunderstanding," Creighton said. The Polish scraped clean from his voice. "Whatever Vernon has been telling people, he's a disoriented old man. He's been throwing around false accusations ever since we stepped in to help with his money. I can clear this up completely. I just need 5 minutes with my attorney." "You'll get the chance to reach an attorney once you've been processed," Officer Hargrove said. "Right now you need to comply. Turn around." Creighton turned around. The handcuffs clicked a hard final sound that the quiet October air carried perfectly across the driveway and over the clipped lawn. When the second cuff snapped home, Creighton's whole body jolted with it, an involuntary shudder he could not hold back. Officer Hargrove recited the words evenly as he finished securing Creighton's wrists. "Creighton Drexel, you are being detained for questioning in connection with aggravated identity theft, fraudulent loan procurement, and filing a false police report. Federal investigators have been notified and are coordinating with this department on the financial crime elements of this case. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you." Every one of Creighton's accounts sat at zero. The attorney he desperately needed was as far out of reach as the mortgage he'd never pay again. "Vernon," Creighton said, twisting his head back toward the workshop porch as the officers steered him down the steps. Gone was all of it. The developer's assurance, the negotiator's precision, the version of this man who had once stood in my kitchen and flung ice water at a 68-year-old widower to demonstrate who held the power. What the handcuffs left behind was rawer, smaller, and frightened. "Vernon, listen to me. There's still a way through this. Name what you want, anything, and we end it here. You don't have to let this go further." From the porch, I watched him. The way you watch something you've already settled, clear-eyed, no anger left to spend. "I didn't do this to you, Creighton," I told him. "You did it yourself the first time you sat down with a pen and worked at writing my name." They placed him in the rear seat of the first patrol car. The door shut with a thunk that rang once off the stone face of the $4.2 million house before the morning swallowed it. Lynette had stood through all of it beside the second patrol car, her palms flat against the vehicle's side panel, as though the sheet metal was the only thing keeping her vertical. When that door closed on Creighton, a sound came out of her, not a word, not quite a cry, but something between the two, the noise a person makes when the last thing holding their world upright has just been pulled away. She turned in my direction, and I braced myself for her to cross the lawn at a run. Instead, she moved toward me in uneven steps, stopping at the driveway's edge 10 feet below the workshop porch, and looked up at me, with eyes gone dark and swollen, every wall she'd ever built behind them flattened. "Dad," she said. It came out with a break in the center of it, the same way it used to when she was little, and had fallen and wanted me to make it stop. "Dad, please, just tell me what I'm supposed to do. Tell me how I can fix it. I'll do exactly what you say." The birds that had been singing were gone quiet. The second patrol car sat idling on the drive. From somewhere along the street, a lawnmower droned to life, careless and unchanged by any of this. I held my eyes on my daughter's face for a long moment. "Go inside, Lynette," I said, keeping my voice low. "There's a notice on the workshop door. Read it. It'll tell you what you need to know." Then I turned away and went back inside. The door closed at my back. I lowered myself into the wooden chair beside the workbench, set both palms against the worn surface wood that Rosalind and I had shaped together years ago, and I breathed. Pine resin, linseed oil, old grain. For the first time since the previous night, I allowed the full weight of what that morning had demanded of me to settle in. It was considerable. I had never wanted this particular ending for my daughter. I had wanted her to turn out otherwise. I had wanted her to still be the child who perched on the workbench stool and wondered aloud whether wood could feel itself being made into something. For 2 years, I had carried that image of her in a workshop 40 feet from a house where someone else was taking her place. Rosalind used to say, It plainly wanting a thing, with everything you have, does not conjure it into being. I sat with that until I heard the patrol cars go, tires over gravel, the clang of the gate. Then the street came back to itself, the unremarkable sounds of a Saturday morning carrying on. I got up, straightened my jacket, and dialed Aldous. Aldous' crew came in through the rear service gate at 12:40 in the afternoon, 3 men climbing out of a plain white cargo van, moving with the contained efficiency of professionals who understand that their job is to be forgotten. I'd set this in motion 2 weeks prior, once it became clear the whole situation was heading for a conclusion, and that I intended to be somewhere else when it landed. From the workshop doorway, I watched them move through the space. No wasted motion, nothing out of sequence. The wooden chair first, then every tool from the workbench in its labeled case, then the row of books from the shelf above the window, then the clothes and bedding out of the narrow closet. The oval mirror got wrapped in a double layer of moving blankets. 2 men carried it between them. Last to leave was the small wooden stool from the corner, the one Rosalind had occupied in 1986, kerosene lamp, glowing beside her, a book open across her knees. 23 minutes from the moment they pulled in the van, eased back out through the rear gate, and was gone. I made one last pass through the emptied workshop. Pine walls hold a room's history, the way seasoned timber holds everything it has ever known, the decades of sawdust and effort and quiet human hours pressed into the wood itself. On the concrete floor, you could still read the furniture's outline in faint, darker patches where the dust had never quite settled. The window above the workbench threw an oblong of afternoon light across the bare floor, and it illuminated nothing now, because there was nothing left to illuminate. I went down on one knee near the baseboard, where the braided rug had lain, and pressed my open palm to the floor above the loose plank. The lockbox was long gone. Aldous' team had taken it earlier that morning while I sat on the patio, but my hand stayed there a beat longer, feeling the wood. What rose up then was not the memory I might have predicted. It was a Tuesday in March of 2018, 8 months before Rosalind's diagnosis. She had driven out to the Whitmore Woodcraft facility on the south side of Richmond to bring me lunch the way she still did from time to time, even after the operation had grown enough that I kept a full kitchen crew on the premises. The paper bag sat between us on my desk. She watched me get through half a sandwich before she spoke. Then, "Vernon," she said, "when you sell this company, what are you going to do with the money?" I set the sandwich down. The acquisition offer from the private equity group had been on the table for weeks, but Rosalind had never put that particular question to me directly. "Take care of you," I told her. "Take care of Lynette. Build something that lasts." Rosalind peeled back the wrapping on her own sandwich and held it without eating, turning it over in her mind the way she turned over everything. "I want you to promise me something," she said. "Promise me that whatever you build next, you build it for people who need it, not for people who expect it." "What is the difference?" I asked. She gave me the look she had, the one that said she knew perfectly well I wasn't as confused as I was pretending. "Vernon," she said, "you know exactly what the difference is." I did know. I simply needed her voice to make it real enough to hold on to. Rosalind had never set foot in this workshop. The structure itself was recent. Creighton had gutted a storage outbuilding at the edge of the property and remade it, but the wooden stool had followed me from the original space on Richmond's west side, and the oval mirror had gone up on the wall of every room Rosalind and I had ever shared, starting with the first apartment we rented together. I had hauled both items here on purpose. Her presence was what I needed around me while I sat and waited. I got to my feet and moved to the door. At eye level on its inner face was a single sheet of paper I had pinned there intentionally, a formal notice to vacate issued by the holding company now in control of the foreclosed property. It gave the current occupant 72 hours to clear all personal belongings from the premises, described the property as a seized asset under active foreclosure proceedings, referenced the pending fraud investigation, and made plain that non-compliance would bring the Henrico County Sheriff's Department to the door. I took the notice down, folded it along a single crease, and placed it flat on the bare floor near the center of the room, right where Lynette would come across it when she eventually came looking for me. Then, I walked out and pulled the workshop door shut at my back for the final time. Out across the grass, the rear patio stood deserted. Someone from the catering company had retrieved their gear, and the long teak table was stripped clean in the flat afternoon light. No champagne glasses, no silver trays. Every trace of what Creighton had so painstakingly arranged that morning had been cleared away, leaving only the stone and the cold October air. I made my way around to the front of the property, skirting the main house entirely. The circular drive was still. Creighton's sports car occupied its regular spot, gleaming immobile, a vehicle that had run out of both destination and driver. I climbed into my 14-year-old Accord on the service road and pulled away from Windsor Farms, with my eyes forward, never once checking the mirror. I already knew what I was leaving behind. Lynette had gone back inside once the patrol cars cleared out. She had moved through each silent room, hit the light switches and gotten nothing, opened the taps and gotten nothing. It was no accident. Every utility account connected to that address had been shut off that morning, because for 2 years every one of those accounts had been settled quietly, without a name attached, through the same blind trust that carried the mortgage. The moment I drove away, the entire scaffolding of the life they had built collapsed with me. Eventually, she would make her way across the lawn, ease the workshop door open, and find the barren room and the folded notice lying on the floor. Then her eye would travel to the interior wall alongside the doorframe, and she would see the one thing I had found myself unable to remove. High in the far corner of that wall, at roughly the height of a grown person standing, was a small shape cut into the pine with a pocket knife. 2 letters nestled inside a rough heart. WND. I had made that carving on our first anniversary back in the original workshop on the west side of Richmond. When we outgrew that space and moved to larger premises, I had taken a saw to that particular stretch of pine, pried the carved section free, and carried it with me for years, waiting until I had a workshop of my own where it could belong. It was all I had left of Rosalind, and it was the only piece of her I chose to leave behind. The Friday following the arrest, Richmond was behaving the way it does come November. A rain that fell without drama or mercy, too thin to be a proper storm, too relentless to ignore, turning every exposed surface dull and gray. I had taken a temporary apartment on the 14th floor of a building on Grove Avenue for the week. While Aldous wrapped up the final trust transfers and the remaining holding company documents, I pushed through the revolving glass door of Aldous' building at 4:20 in the afternoon, overcoat buttoned tight against the weather, my thoughts still running over the paperwork I had just put my signature to inside. The Whitmore Family Educational Trust was formally in place. The scaffolding was complete. What was left, scholarship criteria, disbursement, schedules, board appointments, all the fine-grained architecture of something built to outlast any one person, was work for the coming weeks. I was fishing in my coat pocket for my phone to reach the driver when I spotted her. She stood against the granite face of the building, tucked partway under the overhang arms, folded hard across a thin beige trench coat that had no business being out in this weather. Her hair clung flat and wet to her face. She had on gray sweatpants. Her canvas shoes were soaked through, gone nearly black with rain. The pearl earrings were nowhere in sight. She had the look of someone who had been planted in that spot for a while. Lynette came off the wall the moment she caught sight of me stepping through the door. She moved 3 paces in my direction. Then something gave out in her legs, and she dropped to both knees on the wet pavement, hard enough that the sound of it reached me clearly. Both her hands caught the hem of my overcoat and closed around it like a grip on the only solid thing left in the world. She raised her face toward mine, rain and tears indistinguishable on her cheeks, her eyes raw and swollen, and stripped of every defense, more open than I had seen them since she was very small. "Daddy," she said, the word fracturing on the second syllable. "Daddy, please. Please just look at me." I looked. I held her gaze, and I did not retreat. "I am so sorry," she said, the words arriving in fragments, separated by ragged breathing. "I am so sorry for all of it. For what Creighton did to you, for what I let happen, for the papers I signed, for turning away from you in that kitchen." Her forehead dropped briefly against my coat. Then she lifted her eyes again. "I did not understand what he was doing, Dad. I believed the loans were legitimate. He said they were a formality, that you had given your word, that the documents were just a technicality. I should have gone to you myself and asked. I know that. I was frightened of what the answer might be." I let her finish without saying a word. When she was done, the rain went on, doing what it had been doing all afternoon, quiet and impartial, working the concrete around us. A man in a dark suit came by at a clip, veering around Lynette's knees without breaking stride, the way people in cities learn to move past anything. "Lynette," I said. The steadiness in my voice cost me something. "Tell me one true thing. Not the version Creighton coached, and not the version you think will reach me. One true thing." She held my gaze for several seconds. Her hold on my coat went slack a fraction. "I knew something was wrong," she said, her voice low. "I couldn't have told you exactly what, but I knew, and I put my name on those papers regardless because I was too afraid of watching his world come down around us. I chose the life over you." Those last 4 words fell out of her nearly soundless. "I chose the life over you, Dad. I have known that since the day I watched him hurl that water at you and I turned my back and walked away." The rain came down, without let-up. From behind me drifted the sound of a car easing to the curb, my driver on the minute. Rosalind had always maintained that I kept time the way a man does when he truly understands its worth, which was among the kinder ways she dressed up what everyone else simply called stubbornness. I slipped my hand into the inside pocket of the overcoat and withdrew a small piece of paper folded once. I extended it toward Lynette. She let go of my coat and accepted it with both hands, opening it with care, her damp fingertips marking the surface faintly. It held the address of a workforce reentry center on North Boulevard that Aldis's office had located a non-profit offering job, placement assistance, financial counseling, and transitional housing support for people putting their lives back together after serious disruption. The center carried a strong track record and had no waiting list. "That is where you begin," I said. "Not with me, not with anything I can give you with yourself." Lynette was still on her knees on the rain-soaked pavement when I looked down at her, that small folded slip of paper held in both hands. The wet had worked through the shoulders of her thin trench coat, darkening the fabric in irregular blotches. Her canvas shoes had given up entirely. She was shivering the kind she probably wasn't aware of, a low, continuous tremor running through her shoulders and arms without pause. She read the address twice, then raised her eyes to mine. "This is a shelter," she said. The words came in flat, not bitter, just emptied of everything but the plain fact she was reading off the page. "It is a re-entry center," I said. "There is a difference. They offer transitional housing, job placement counselors, financial literacy programs. The woman who runs it is named Bet Orville. She has helped several hundred people rebuild from circumstances considerably worse than yours." Aldis's office called ahead. "They are expecting you." Lynette looked back down at the paper. A raindrop broke free from the overhang above and landed on the page, opening a small, dark circle near the corner. "Dad," she said, and that single syllable tore on the way out in a way that told me how much it cost her to push through it. "I know I have no right to ask you for anything. I know that, but I need you to understand that I am not the same person who put her name on those papers. I need you to know that I have been sick with it every day from the moment it became clear what we had actually done to you." I held her gaze for a long moment. The November rain fell without pause around us, cold and indifferent, the way weather is, when it has no stake in what passes beneath it. "And tell me something, Lynette," I said. "The night Creighton threw that water at me, you were standing 4 feet away. You watched it happen, and then you turned and walked into the other room." I stopped. "What were you feeling in that exact moment? Not afterward. Not now? What were you feeling right then?" She pressed her lips together hard. Her chin gave way slightly. "Relief." The word arrived barely above a whisper. "I felt relieved that it was you and not me, that his anger had landed on you and not on me." She closed her eyes. "I have never said that aloud before. I have never even let myself think it that plainly before." She opened her eyes and looked directly at me. The shame on her face was the most unguarded thing I had seen there in years. "I am disgusted by it, Dad. I am disgusted by the person I was in that kitchen." Something moved in my chest. Not forgiveness, not yet, and perhaps not ever in the shape she was hoping for, but something. An acknowledgement that the woman kneeling before me on the wet pavement was making a genuine attempt at the truth, which was more than the woman in the ivory silk blouse and her mother's pearl earrings had been willing to offer. I bent down so that we were level with each other. My knees registered their objection. At 68, they had earned that right, and I ignored them the way I had been ignoring inconvenient things for the better part of a lifetime. "Your mother warned me," I said. "Not about you in particular, about what money does to people who aren't ready for it. She could see it happening years before I was prepared to look." I held Lynette's gaze. Rosalind was not a complicated woman. She wanted a life built on real things, real work, real relationships, real love. The size of the house never mattered to her, nor the car out front, nor whether the guests at dinner went home impressed. She simply lived that way. I paused. "You grew up watching her do it, At some point you decided it wasn't enough. I don't know exactly when that turned, and I'm not sure it matters anymore. Lynette's tears ran freely, blending into the rain on her face, until neither could be told apart from the other. I remember her in the workshop, Lynette said. When I was small, she used to sit on that stool in the corner and read while you worked. She always looked so content there. I used to think there was no duller way to spend an afternoon. Her voice gave out on the last words. I would give anything to be sitting on that stool right now. I felt Rosalind's letter against my chest through the wool of the overcoat, and the layer of my jacket beneath a weight I had carried every day since Aldous placed the envelope in my hands. She loved you completely, I said. That never changed. It would not have changed no matter what you did. But love is not the same thing as shelter from consequences. Your mother understood that better than most. I rose slowly to my full height. What you do with the address in your hand is your decision. I am not going to make it for you, and I won't be standing here watching you make it. That chapter of my life is closed. Lynette looked up at me from the wet sidewalk, the paper trembling faintly in her grip. Will you ever forgive me? She asked. I thought about Rosalind in the hospital, asking me to swear I wouldn't let my love for Lynette be turned into a weapon against me. I thought about 2 years in a workshop, in the same 3 sweaters, watching through a window as my daughter became someone I no longer recognized. I thought about the carving on the pine wall, the W and the D inside a rough heart, the one thing I hadn't been able to take with me when I walked out. I don't know, I said. It was the most truthful answer I had. The town car sat idling at the curb, my driver steady behind the tinted glass. I stood straight, fastened the top button of my overcoat against the rain, and took one last look at my daughter. Your mother used to say that the most important thing any person can build is a life they're not ashamed of, I said. She built one, I built one. You still have time to build one, but you have to start with the truth. And you have to start today, not tomorrow. Not once things ease up. They are not going to ease up first. I stepped down off the curb and walked to the car. The driver had the door standing open before I arrived. I got in, settled into the warm leather, and pressed the button to close the door. Through the tinted rear window, I could make out Lynette still kneeling on the wet concrete, both hands cradling that small folded paper, her head bowed into the rain. The car pulled away from the curb without a jolt and folded into the moving traffic on Grove Avenue, and the figure on the sidewalk grew smaller, then was gone as we swung around the corner. I faced forward. I breathed in the warm stillness of the interior and did not say a single word for a very long time. 2 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of November, I signed the last document. The penthouse Aldous had arranged sat on the 60th floor of a tower on Broad Street, 22 minutes from the building where I had watched my daughter drop to her knees on a rain-soaked sidewalk the Friday before. The apartment was spare and uncluttered, with floor-to-ceiling windows along the south and east walls that opened onto Richmond in every direction. Church steeples and office towers, the long gray threads of the interstate exchanges dissolving into the Piedmont haze at the horizon. I hadn't filled it with much. A table, 2 chairs, a bed, the books from the workshop, shelves, and the oval mirror from above the workbench, which the moving crew had rehung in the hallway, where the morning light struck it at the same angle it always had. The stool from the original space on Richmond's west side stood in the corner of the main room. I had propped Rosalind's letter against the base of the lamp on the table 3 days earlier when I moved in, and I hadn't touched it since. I wasn't ready to put it away. I wasn't certain I ever would be. The document before me was the final executed charter of the Whitmore Family Educational Trust, a legal instrument transferring the majority of the assets held in my blind trust into an irrevocable charitable foundation with a single purpose: full scholarships covering tuition, housing, and living expenses for students from low-income households in Henrico County, attending 2-year and 4-year accredited institutions. The first class of recipients would be chosen in the spring. Aldous estimated the trust could fund between 40 and 60 full scholarships each year in perpetuity based on conservative investment returns. I uncapped the fountain pen Rosalind had given me on our 30th anniversary, a spare gold instrument with my initials engraved on the barrel in her handwriting, and signed my name at the bottom of the final page, Vernon R. Whitmore, in my own hand. No one had rehearsed it. No one had lifted it from a birthday card or studied it off a grocery list, or logged hours at a desk perfecting the particular way the W curved at the top, or the loop of the final E fell just below the line. It was mine entirely. I set the pen down and looked out over the city. Somewhere to the south, the Windsor Farms property was being formally turned over to the county as the foreclosure proceedings reached their conclusion. Creighton was awaiting trial on 4 counts of aggravated identity theft and 3 counts of bank fraud represented by a court-appointed public defender because every account carrying his name had been frozen. His trial date was set for March of the following year. Lynette had contacted Aldis's office on the Monday after our exchange on the sidewalk. She had scheduled an appointment at the re-entry center on North Boulevard for the same afternoon. Aldis had passed this along to me, without editorializing, which was the correct thing to do. I had not called her. I did not yet know whether I would. I reached across the table and picked up Rosalind's letter. The paper had gone soft at its folds from months of handling the ivory shade deepened at the edges to something closer to cream. I opened it and read it through one more time, not because the words were unfamiliar. I had them memorized by now, but because certain things deserve to be read slowly in good light with your full attention given over to them. She had written it on a Tuesday morning in the hospital 3 weeks before she died. The nurses told me afterward that she had asked for paper and a pen at 6 in the morning and had spent 2 hours at it resting, often turning away any offers of help. She had sealed it herself and left it with Aldis, with a single instruction: give it to me only after I open the lockbox. She had known I would open it eventually. She had known me that well. I read her words in the November light. The city lay spread below me through the glass. And when I reached the last line, the Vietnamese phrase she had borrowed from our old neighbor on Hathaway Road and made her own across 30 years of quiet use between the two of us, I spoke it aloud in the still apartment. Jung Chui Jiao, do not bow your head. I folded the letter back along its creases and set it on the table next to the signed trust documents. Then I reached for the glass of ice water I had poured earlier and left sitting by the lamp. The glass was clear, the ice barely touched by the cool air of the apartment, the water cold and undisturbed. I lifted it toward the light, the way you lift something when you want to see it for what it actually is. 3 weeks earlier, a glass of ice water had been hurled into my face in a kitchen in Windsor Farms while my daughter turned away. It had run down my nose and soaked into my collar and dripped from my chin onto a marble floor I had no claim to. The intention had been to diminish me, to make me feel small, and without recourse, a guest in someone else's life, who could be dismissed at will. I took a slow, deliberate sip. The water was cold and clean and tasted of nothing but itself, which is precisely how water tastes when it isn't being wielded as an instrument of contempt. I set the glass down beside Rosalind's letter. Beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, Richmond moved through its Tuesday morning, with the easy indifference of a city that does not stop for private reckonings. Traffic thickening on the interstate office towers, filling floor by floor, the Piedmont light growing sharper as the sun climbed higher. Somewhere out in that city, 40 students who had no idea my name existed would one day open a letter telling them their education had been paid for by a man. They had never met a man who had built something from salvaged lumber and a second-hand ledger typewriter alongside a woman who believed the things most worth having were the ones you made with your own hands. I looked at the stool in the corner. I looked at Rosalind's letter on the table. I looked at the signed charter of the Whitmore Family Educational Trust. And then I did something I had not done in 4 years. Not since the morning the hospital called and told me to come immediately. Not since I had sat in a parking garage for 40 minutes afterward, unable to put the car in drive. Not since the grief had settled into my chest like a weather system that had lost all interest in moving on. I smiled. If you are still with me, thank you, truly. This story asks something of you, and I do not take that lightly. Vernon spent years in a workshop the size of a single room, wearing the same 3 sweaters, watching his own daughter choose comfort over conscience. What it cost him cannot be measured in dollars, though the dollars were considerable. What it taught him is harder to name and more lasting. He did not rush. He did not collapse. He built something quiet and permanent, while the people who underestimated him went on making noise. I believe God has a way of honoring patience like that, not always on our schedule, and rarely in the shape we imagined, but honoring it nonetheless. Here is what I take from Vernon's story, and what I hope you carry with you. Protect what you build. Document everything, and never let your name rest on paper you have not read with your own eyes. Silence is not weakness. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is say nothing and keep working. Love your children fully, but do not confuse love with the absence of consequences. The two can coexist. If someone shows you who they are, believe them and plan accordingly. This is the kind of family revenge story that stays with you, because it is not really about revenge at all. It is about a man who refused to let betrayal be the last word written about his life. For those of us in the adults 50-plus season of living, Vernon's story is a reminder that it is never too late to build something that outlasts the people who tried to take everything from you. If this story moved you, I hope you will share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Leave a comment and tell me what stayed with you. I read them, and they matter. And if you have not yet subscribed to Honor Revenge Stories, now is a good time. There are more stories waiting. Thank you for listening. Take good care of yourself.